This is Garis Masculist MGTOW flyers, that is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 634, entitled Masculist Messages to Women. Description. This flyer presents the big three desiderata of the masculists towards women, that is, 1. To fib up or be manless. 2. To learn some masculism, become biconscious or be punished. And 3. To vote with men for the menfairing of the gender laws. These big three are first listed and then elaborated upon one by one. The flyer itself. Masculist Messages to Women by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. What do masculists want from women? ? This flyer provides the main answers, listed initially in bullet format, followed by elaborations. Bullet. Fib up or be manless. Bullet. Learn some masculism, become biconscious or be punished. Bullet. Vote with men for the menfairing of the gender laws. These three things are probably the most important of the desiderata of the masculists towards women. They are now elaborated one by one. Bullet. Fib up or be manless. The core idea of masculism, that is written into the very subtitle of my book, Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Manslaves to Women, is the critical importance of the fipping of women, the creation of a fip society, where both sexes, especially young women, are socialized and educated to be fips, that's financially independent persons, so that they do not manslave and divorce rape men, which are seen by masculists as horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes against men, and hence hated by masculists, who then punish these gender criminal women by effectively exterminating them, by forcing them to rot on the shelf, by being totally ignored, not even pumped and dumped, for expecting, fluffy style, to be able to leech off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life. Masculists argue that it was men who liberated women from household drudgery by giving women science-based medicine, the pill, household gadgets, higher education. So women now have a career window of half a century, so can work. So masculists apply powerful moral pressure on women to fib up, to pull their own financial weight and not parasite off the money of a man, or be severely punished by men, masculisted men, by not getting one. Forced to rot on the shelf, spat at by masculists, utterly rejected, treated as vermin, to be wiped out. Masculism is forcing women to grow up, to take responsibility for their own lives, to become responsible adults who bother to get career competent educations in high school and college so that they become fips as adults, who don't become fluffy crappers in high school, who choose to study fluffy crap majors that will force them to study more fluffy crap majors at college, resulting in a fluffy crapper obtaining a fluffy crap diploma, which the economy does not value. So she will be poor as a result, then screw around in her 20s, not saving. Then with her biological clock ticking in her 30s, she will realise she doesn't have the economic clout enough to pay for her own middle-class house to raise her kids in. So she will then start looking around for some gullible, stupid, ignorant, man-slavable man to work for her, to pay for her to live in a middle-class house so she can raise her kids in it. Her husband will be her 41st penis after her whore phase in her 20s. So she will be unable to emotionally bond strongly with him. So after a decade, once she has had her two kids and the middle-class house, she will get bored with him and take him to the fluffy feminist-dominated divorce court and have him butchered. She will get custody of her kids with a 90% probability. She'll get the house to raise her kids in. She'll get half his wealth and stuff, and often she'll be given alimony with no legal nor moral obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and fip up, so that she continues to parasite off the money of her ex-husband after the divorce the way she did before the divorce. This massive gender crime that fluffies commit against men is so hated by the masculists that we effectively exterminate such women, forcing them to rot on the shelf, manless, loveless, sexless, and spat at. Masculists see fluffies as manslaving, divorce-raping vermin to be exterminated, and we can do that easily, simply by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them. This masculist philosophy is now so widespread amongst young men, as evidenced by the fact, according to a Pew P-E-W research poll, that in the US 60% of young men under 30 refuse to even date young women, let alone marry them and give these women their sperm. The masculist mantra is that, quote, now that women can work, they must work. Anything else is man's slavery, and man's slavery will get women killed slowly by being forced to rot on the shelf, end quote. Masculists aim to spread masculist ideas across the campuses, then to the high schools, where the real fluffy crapper damage is done. Educating high school boys to look upon fluffy crapper female classmates as future manslavers and divorce rapists, and hence the type of women to be avoided. Masculists predict that in the coming 5 to 10 years, several million young fluffies at high school will commit suicide over the issue of not fipping up, due to being massively rejected by their male classmates, who will see them as vile, contemptible fluffies, as future manslavers and divorce rapists, the type of woman that the masculists are aiming to wipe off the face of the earth by removing their fluffy genes from the gene pool. Bullet. Learn some masculism, become biconscious, or be punished. Masculists have an even greater hatred of fluffy feminists than they do of fluffies, since it's bad enough that fluffy feminists are fluffies and hence manslaving, divorce-raping vermin, but worse, they are seen by masculists as hypocrites and genociders. A fluffy feminist is a feminist who still has fluffy expectations of men, that is, seeing men as cash machines put on this earth to pay for women to have babies. Feminism is a deeply misandrist, genocentric ideology whose central message is that gender oppression is a one-way street, that is, that men oppress women and women are the oppressed. Feminism teaches women nothing, in capital letters, about how women oppress men. So not surprisingly, most feminists, most monoconscious feminists, in brackets, who only have had their feminist consciousness raised, who are not biconscious, that is, having not had both their feminist and their masculist consciousnesses raised, close brackets, are angry at men, because that is what feminism teaches them. They have not had their feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women, for example, rape, domestic violence, sexual harassment, etc., cancelled by a corresponding female masculist anger at women for the ways that women oppress men, for example, manslavery, divorce, rape, forced fathering, etc. So are very unpleasant for men to be with, which explains why so many monoconscious feminists don't have boyfriends, seen by masculists as being MFBs, that's monoconscious feminazi bigots, who refuse to accept the idea that gender oppression is very much a two-way street, and that in fact women oppress men worse than vice versa, since many of women's gender crimes against men are horrible and last decades. For example, the masculist big three, that is, the worst three ways that women oppress men, that is, women's manslavery, women's divorce, rape, and women's forced fathering. Masculists expect all women to become biconscious or will be punished by men, masculisted men, by being sneered at for not being biconscious. Masculists find monoconscious feminists, MFBs, utterly disagreeable to be around, so choose not to have relationships with such feminazi bitchy women, and leave them to rot on the shelf. Masculists find the monoconscious hypocrisy, that is, wanting equal rights with men in the parliaments, but behaving as fluffy parasites in the divorce courts, close brackets, of monoconscious feminists intolerable, so do not tolerate MFBs and leave them rotting on the shelf, the way masculists do to fluffies. The masculists have two main enemies, the fluffies and the fluffy feminists. Both groups are left rotting on the shelf as punishment by masculists. As masculist ideas continue to spread across the planet, the way feminist ideas have, most men will become influenced by masculist ideas and will treat fluffies and fluffy feminists with contempt and will punish them by ignoring them, which in time will drive women, monoconscious feminists, crazy, since 99.5% of women are heterosexual, so are dependent on men for their sex and companionship. If no man, no masculisted man, will go near them, then these women will be made utterly miserable, which is their punishment for not being biconscious, for being callous towards men, for not being sympathetic towards men for the horrible ways that women oppress men, and worse than vice versa. Bullet. Vote with men for the menfairing of the gender laws. Masculists are political animals who preach hatred and war against fluffies and fluffy feminists by effectively wiping them out, by totally ignoring them to death, forcing such women to rot on the shelf, leading manless, miserable lives. 40% of middle-aged women today in Western countries are on antidepressant drugs because they are miserable, living alone, manless, childless, lonely, and joyless. Masculists want political change in society by causing the menfairing of the gender laws. For example, by fundamentally reforming the divorce courts, by tossing out alimony, by scrapping the halving of wealth, by giving custody of the kids jointly by default, and by operating on the principle of financial independence of both divorcing parties, that is the mother and the father, so that the mother is not seen as a man-slaving, divorce-raping parasite, since she is seen as a fip. For this to happen, the masculists push hard for the fipping of women, for the creation of a fip society, where girls are socialised in the same way as boys, that is, to be fips as adults, to take responsibility for their own lives, and not expect, fluffy style, to live off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life. Masculists want the establishment of GECs, Gender Equality Committees, in the parliaments, that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes are addressed equally, which is far from being the case today. Masculists push women to vote with men for the menfairing of the gender laws. Masculists tell young women to hate the fluffy feminists for these young women's babylessness, explaining that the fluffy feminist divorce court judges and lawyers have made divorce so toxic for men that in many countries now 2/3 of young men refuse to marry and reject paternity, thus causing these young women's babylessness, because these young men refuse to give these young women their sperm, because they absolutely refuse to face a 1 chance in 4 of being butchered in the hated, fluffy feminist controlled divorce court system. Thus the masculists are aiming to have both sexes express a hatred towards the fluffy feminists, the monoconscious feminists. So masculists push women to vote with men for the establishment of these GECs, Gender Equality Committees, so that the gender laws can be men-faired, particularly the 2 big ones, namely the PARA and the OPTAB, OPTAB. The PARA is the paternity rejection right, the lack of which, given that women have the MARA, maternity rejection right, aka abortion right, is the most blatant example of sexual discrimination that exists, that screams out for reform. Women have the legislated right to reject an unwanted pregnancy, but men don't. So millions of women can force a man into unwanted fatherhood by pill lying and paternity fraud, thus committing a decades-lasting and truly hated gender crime against men. So the Masculists want the para and the op-tab legislated, in brackets, obligatory paternity testing at birth for all births, to block paternity fraud, that is when a woman lies to her man that the kid growing in her is his when she knows it's not, close brackets. Masculists want women who commit forced fathering to be put in jail for 15 years, since it is a worse crime than rape, which usually gets a man a 10-year sentence. The Masculist half of these gecs will then systematically remove those laws across the board that discriminate against men. These Masculist politicians will push hard for the creation of a FIP society, pushing for women to be FIPs and not expect to parasite off the labour and money of a man like a hated vermin fluffy. The above three main desiderata that Masculists want of women will go a long way towards the liberation of men, which is the fundamental goal of the Masculists. The very meaning of the word Masculist is men's lib. Men need to be liberated, which is far from being the case today, where men are routinely manslaved, divorced, raped, forced fathered, etc. Men need to be liberated, which is what the Masculists are all about. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Author of the book Masculism, Men's Rebellion Against Being Man-Slaves to Women, an e-textbook of 630 plus Masculist flyers for men's studies courses, freely downloadable in Microsoft Word format from my website. These flyers are available in text and video formats on Minds, BitChute, Odyssey and MGTOW.tv.